Thanks for tuning in to this another edition of Rutgers Edge TV. I'm really excited to have my friend and colleague, Erica here from ArborBridge Test Prep, who's going to give us an update, since I realized we have not talked about testing for almost a year now. And obviously there's been a lot of changes. So I thought this would be a really good time to kind of touch base about some things, some changes that are out there for students and families to be aware of, especially for, possibly juniors that are going to be rising seniors. There might be some things on the horizon they weren't aware of. We'll kind of dive into some things, as well as at the end of what Erica is going to present, we'll talk a little bit about test optional, test flexible, test required, all of those things. So again, really want to make sure that families go into this process and understand what is going to be needed for your child to have as many options as possible. So Erica, thanks so much for joining us today. And then I will let you take it away with giving us a little bit of an update from your end.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much, Karen, for having me. And yeah, I think probably the biggest bit of news that's come out over the last year, coming out of the pandemic and sort of the haze of everyone being in their holes, is that Collegeboard made a huge announcement earlier this year that they are going to be moving over to a digital SAT format in the future. So I thought it'd be a good idea to give you all an idea of what exactly that entails and what the test is going to look like, because it is a pretty significant change. And so giving you an idea of what that change is going to be like and the timeline for that, so that we can make sure that you are ready for all these upcoming changes. So I'm just going to share this with you.
Right.
So the digital SAT, it's going to be a new exam. What I'm going to talk about is what exactly is changing, what the timeline looks like for students, and then of course for you, what exactly does that mean, and as far as how you prepare, when you should start preparing, etc. So we're going to go over the exact format changes that are happening in the test. But the one big thing that I want to kind of underlie this entire thing with is that a lot of students and families get really stressed out when these changes happen, because it is a new type of exam. But really what we liken it to is it's the same house with a fresh painted coat or a fresh coat of paint. So it's really testing the same sorts of skills, the same sorts of content. It's just in a different format with the questions placed in a different type of way. But sort of that it remains the same as a very learnable test, because it's that underlying knowledge with a skill level on top of it, which these tests have always been. It's a test of how to take a test, like most of these standardized exams. So what exactly is changing? So this is what the current version looks like, which is sort of the version we all know and love, if you can call it that. 3 hours, 4 sections out of 1,600, taken at school on paper, obviously, and non-adaptive, which we'll talk about a little bit more about later. There are a couple things that are staying the same with this new format. So the scoring scale is still going to be out of 1,600. So maybe like 8 years ago they did, or 5 years ago, they changed the SAT from a 2,400 to 1,600. So there was a hullabaloo about what do these scores mean? How do these compare, et cetera. So they're keeping the scoring scale the same, which is helpful for students, especially within that transition period. The test is also still going to be at a testing center or at school. So there was a little bit of chatter about being able to do these at home rather than doing it at a center. That's not going to be an option. Just to give you a little bit of behind the scenes work. So the AP tests that happened last year and the year before that were online and at home, those were sort of a test run for Collegeboard for this online format. So for students being able to take this test in a digital format, it allowed them to work out a lot of kinks and figure out what makes sense for the SAT and what doesn't. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there are, of course, some significant changes happening. So there are going to be fewer sections. There are going to be added international test dates. The test itself is going to be shorter, 2 hours versus 3, which is
That's nice.
good. Yep. And also the turnaround time for scores will be shorter. So the scores will be released within probably within a week at the longest, as opposed to waiting for 2 or 3 weeks. And then of course the adaptive portion, which again, I'll go into a little bit more detail later, which is sort of the big thing that's happening. So the format, obvious part being that it's digital. So it will be on a computer. You will not have a paper test in front of you. So students will be taking this test on laptops or tablets, and it can be your own personal computer or a school issued one. So the way that it works is there's going to be an app that you download from the College Board for the SAT. You'll have that on your computer either downloaded before or the morning of the test. When you get to the center, when the proctor will write up the code for your center up there and for your test, you put that in and then it starts your exam. And so once your exam comes up, it shuts down everything else on your computer. So they're really, again, the AP test allowed them to test this out with shutting down all those features, making it a lot more secure, and being able to have students only be able to utilize that test. And so a couple other cool things that they have with this, it's going to auto save. So God forbid there's a blackout or just something happens, it's going to save all your answers up to that point. So you won't lose all of that, or if there's connectivity issues or low battery. And you'll have a lot of digital testing tools, which I'll show you on the next couple of slides, which will still allow you to keep time, calculator, reference sheet, etc. So there's a lot of cool things that they've put in here with this app, which is promising to see. So this is what the actual question will look like on the SAT. So this is a multiple choice math question. You can see it has the question and then the multiple choice answers underneath it. You'll see the timer is up top. We've heard plenty of horror stories from our students who have had proctors that have given them too little or too much time on the exam or on a section. And that is not going to be an issue with this because each student will have this individual timer at the top of their screen. So also for you, you don't have to try and keep track on your own timer or anything like that. It will be up there. You can also flag a question. So if a question is too difficult, you can mark it there up top and say, okay, I want to come back to this later. So this is also available like you would sort of mark something on your paper. And then for the math section, you'll still have this reference sheet easily accessible at the top where you have all these formulas. So you don't have to memorize that or have to jumble around trying to look for these sorts of things. So these are some of the digital tools that they have available on there on the screen for you during the test. So another big thing internationally, especially, which is great, is that they are adding test dates. So now US and non-US based students will all have the same number of test dates available for them, which is fantastic because accessibility is a huge thing. And it's going to match no matter where you are. So that's another big plus of this change. Okay, and so we talked about location. So like I said, there's no at-home testing, so you still have to go to school or a testing center. But because you have the flexibility of bringing your own device, it really is creating more access for students to take this test. And another kind of smart thing that the College Board did is obviously with the pandemic, a lot of schools and governments invested a ton of money in getting students resources or getting schools technology and resources to be able to still study from home or providing them for students. So there are a lot more resources available now than there might have been 3 years ago to be able to do this. So College Board sort of has the advantage of seeing the debacle of the ACT's digital change that happened where you have to go to a location, but you had to use that location's machines. And so it really restricted the number of seats available. But even though you have to go somewhere to take this test, it's not going to limit the number of people that can take the exam at those centers. And then a calculator. This is a great change. So the math section, you'll be able to use a calculator on the entire math section now for the SAT. So they've eliminated the no calculator section, which is great for students that rely heavily on their calculators. So you can either use your own graphing calculator, which we always recommend, or there is a graphing calculator within the app that you can use as well. So this is what that calculator looks like. It's actually an online calculator that a lot of students who don't necessarily have those sorts of resources will use, that you can access online. So you can even practice with this ahead of time in case your battery runs out or your calculator goes on the fritz. So there's a lot of these sorts of resources put into place by Collegeboard on here. Another great thing, like I said, scores are going to be released much earlier. So, especially if you start taking these tests closer to in application season, you're not waiting 2-3 weeks to know what your score is, to know if you have to take it again. You'll get it much sooner so that you can make those decisions more quickly with your counselor. Okay, and then it's a 2-hour test instead of a 3-hour test, which is great because it's a shorter experience overall. I know a lot of students have trouble with testing stamina. I can barely do something for an hour, let alone 2 hours, let alone 3. So a shorter experience is always great. And the good news is that the College Board isn't trying to cram a bunch of more questions into that short time frame. You actually get more time per question. So you're getting that advantage of additional time per question while still having a shorter experience overall, which is fantastic. And so part of the way in which they're doing this is they are decreasing the number of sections in the test. So before you had 4 separate sections, a reading, a writing, and 2 math. So 1 with and 1 without calculator. Now it's just 2 sections overall. So 1 reading and writing and 1 math. The sections themselves will have fewer questions, like I said, and the reading passages are going to be much shorter. So you're not going to have those super long passages anymore. And we'll go more into the details of those changes because that's probably the largest change within a section that they'll have on this test. Another great thing is that the math problems themselves are going to be a lot less wordy. So I know a lot of students ended up doing the ACT instead of the SAT because the ACT is much more straightforward in terms of how they ask their questions. So the SAT is moving towards that as well within this test, which is good for them as well. So you might be thinking, okay, the test is shorter. There are fewer questions, fewer sections. How exactly is this score going to be comparable to what the test is now? And the answer to that is the difficulty, the adaptiveness of this test. So this is probably the biggest change overall in this exam. And this is how the GRE and the GMAT tests, so the graduate level exams, are actually set up. So it's something that we know and are prepared for in terms of how they structure this. So right now, a test in any administration is the same test. So there are a couple issues with that. Security was probably one of the biggest issues. So a lot of tests were leaked, especially internationally. And so what ended up happening is full testing centers had scores canceled or whatnot. And so what has been a big issue that they've been trying to address. So with an adaptive test, because students are getting different questions on their screens in different orders, there's a far smaller chance of cheating, of reproducing these tests, et cetera. And they're also not going to be releasing questions the same way that they did before because of that. But essentially within these section adaptive sections, what they'll be doing is within each section, there are kind of 2 modules. So there's an introductory module or a set of questions that have a large variety of difficulty questions. And so what that first set of questions is determining what difficulty level the remaining questions in that section will give you. So essentially, they're using that first module to put you into a bucket of scores. And then in that second half, they're going to use those questions to put you into more defined parts of that bucket, which is good and bad, as you can imagine, because it puts a lot of pressure onto that first half of each of the sections, because if you sort of tank that first section, it's going to be very difficult to come up out of that into a higher score level. So you can see here, if you do really well in that first section, it'll put you into either a higher difficulty or a medium difficulty set of questions. And so you're sort of put into a bracket of scores, and then it's just further defined in that second half of questions. So this is how they are essentially trying to extract the same score that you would get on a longer test with a fewer number of questions. But what that also means is that in your preparation, there's going to be a lot more mindset coaching, kind of testing, getting that testing mindset and getting strategy in place to make sure that you really have a sure footing in that initial part of the test, because that is really going to impact the rest of your score. And so again, something we're familiar with dealing with and helping students with, but it really is going to, for students who take a little bit to get warmed up in an exam, some people who hit their stride a little bit later, that will be something that you need to work on to be successful in this test overall.
This is crazy. I am blown away because I knew there were some changes, but I didn't really know what was happening. So I am so glad that you're explaining this. And in a way, I love seeing like graphics. I'm like, oh yes, okay, that makes sense, because I don't know that I would understand it another way. So wow, lots of changes.
Yeah, there are a ton of changes. And yeah, so like I said, the scoring is staying the same between the exams. So it's still out of 1,600. So the good news is that the College Board has been testing this format of tests out in specific areas. The College Board has always had a really good relationship with higher education in terms of admissions boards and being able to get feedback on, okay, do these scores seem valid? Do they match up to the student's profile, et cetera? And so what we're seeing so far is that, yes, these scores are reliable, but again, it is going to impact the way in which students prepare, because it's not only going to be, okay, do I know this content, but it's going to be, can I answer these questions up front well enough that I'm setting myself up for success on the rest of the section. So the overall, there's going to be an additional piece to all of this preparation that there might not have been in the past. And then, okay, so going into the reading section. So like I said, this is where there's going to be the biggest change. So right now there are about 4 or 5 passages per section, and there are 10 to 11 questions per passage. So a really long passage and a ton of questions about it. So now the passages are going to be much shorter, and there's going to be 1 question per passage. So, for people who can't concentrate on something for a long time, that lose focus, this is good because it switches content and switches subjects pretty frequently. And a shorter length obviously is helpful to a lot of people. But these are actually similar to reading questions that were on the previous iteration of the SAT, which were short reading passages. Which are deceptively difficult because the advantage of a long passage is that you have a ton of context. So even if you don't understand a specific question, there are enough questions around it. There's so much other information that you can get an idea of what they're asking about. Here, it's if you don't understand what they're asking or saying in that passage, that question is sort of done with. And so it's a double-edged sword as far as that change goes. So that's probably the largest shift in terms of within the content itself of what's changing on the exam. So timeline and when exactly will this start happening? So internationally, so outside the US, next March, this coming March, 9 months away, crazy, is when the digital SAT will first be given internationally. And they're switching over all centers outside the US to that digital format. So they'll be the first round. And then in fall of next year, the PSAT everywhere will be digital. And then starting spring of 2024 is when the digital SAT will begin in the US. There's not going to be any paper-based format SAT after that point.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a shift, it's something that they've definitely had prepared and in the works. And so what that means for classes. So internationally, rising juniors right now, they are going to be the first impacted class because it's changing next in the middle of the school year for them. Rising sophomores internationally will have about a year of testing out in the ether and experience. So we'll have a little bit more data and information to use, but I don't like to use the word guinea pig, but it's, sort of that initial rising junior class. If you take, especially within those first couple of administrations, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, we generally try to avoid in a new testing format. But you really will, there's inevitably hiccups, technologically. Scoring can sometimes fluctuate and be weird within those first couple of tests as well. And so we generally steer students away from that if possible within that. So this is for international students. And then for US, rising sophomores are going to be the first impacted class of this. So you'll get the digital PSAT in the fall of your junior year, and then the SAT will switch over. So the nice thing is that even if you do take the digital SAT in the US at that time, we'll have had experience internationally with it. So we'll have a lot more information on the exams. And B, you'll have had experience with the digital PSAT at that point as well. So that'll still be a big advantage for you. And then rising freshmen right now, everything will be digital. It's really hard to say that word a lot of times by the time you end up taking these tests. So what does that mean for you as a student? So there are a lot of great things about this new SAT. You get more time per question. It's a shorter test, so you need less stamina. You get to use a calculator on all the questions. Those math problems are more straightforward. If there's a particularly hard reading passage, that's not going to impact your score as broadly as it might now. And there's also no paired questions. So the anchor and evidence are a type of question that were in the reading passages. So that's not going to happen anymore. But again, because of the adaptive format, it really is going to require an extra layer of strategy and mindset preparation that you might not have had in the past. And also practicing in that digital format will be something that's super important to your success overall on the exam. And so for testing timeline, we recommend using those class timelines. So I can send you all a link to the PDFs for those testing timelines, whether you're an international or a domestic student. So you can get a bird's eye view of when those tests are coming out and when you should take it. Like I said, if you are in the impacted class, so really the rising juniors internationally, the options that we're recommending for most people is if you are taking the SAT, if that's the better test for you, to try and do the paper one before it switches over. So getting started early and trying to be done by December. Or if you're relatively equal, just doing the ACT, because we know, or 99% sure that's not going to change dramatically in the next year or two. And then, or 3, if you do want to do the digital SAT, because that's what works better in your timeline, to avoid probably the March and May dates, just so that you can let those first couple ones ride, so that we have a little bit familiarity and can get you the right sorts of resources to do well on that test. So yeah, essentially prepping for the exam is going to be not very different from what it is now. It's similar content. The digital practice is a huge thing. What's really cool is we have developed an online platform for taking a digital exam. So that's developed for the ACT, and a lot of that infrastructure is going to be applied towards the SAT as well. And so we're building that out, as well as making sure we have enough questions to practice. So we have a curriculum team busy at work putting all of that together. So you can imagine.
You're like, thanks, College Board. Let's just add more stuff to our plate to keep changing things
Yeah.
around.
Exactly. And the College Board will be releasing more material probably by the end of summer, early fall. They'll be sending out more information about the testing app and having some practice through Khan Academy. So that's, again, something that our team, it sounds weird, but they love doing those things. So they're going through those as soon as it's released and just analyzing them. And then, of course, the fall 2023 PSAT, because that'll be digital, that'll have a lot of information as well. So that's a lot of information on the digital SAT. But Karen, I'll send you links to those timelines, so you can send those out to students if they need it. But yeah, that's
great. No, this is such good information. And obviously, for any students that are thinking about starting to prepare, I mean, obviously, I always recommend ArborBridge. You guys are amazing with so many of my students. And I know that in the past, there was, maybe prior to the whole pandemic thing, there was a little bit of hesitancy to do tutoring online. But I think most of my families that have now done it, they're like, oh, it's not as scary, or the students are really comfortable with it. So, getting them a chance to practice doing tutoring online, but then also the actual test will be online anyway. So it's like getting a chance to practice that is really good. I wanted to just touch on two different things that have come up in my practice of different students. And please, if there's any thoughts or notes about this, obviously there's been some schools that since the pandemic kind of happened, have gone test blind, meaning they will not take a test, or a test score, even if you submit it for admission purposes. So the largest system, University of California, Cal State University, those are the largest systems that have gone to test blind. I will mention that they still say on their websites, even if they're not using a test score for admission purposes, they can still use a test score for course placement. So if there are questions about whether or not you need to go into a remedial math or a remedial English type course or whatever, they can use an SAT or an ACT to place you into either, whatever it is, English 101 or sociology, if you haven't met that requirement in your high school curriculum. So that's one thing I want to bring up, that even though it is test blind, that yes, you may not need the test for admission purposes. It may be used in other ways. Second, I would bring up that many schools still use the SAT or ACT in terms of awarding merit scholarships. So if they're going to do an automatic award, a lot of times it is on it's on an index, or it's on a scale of, well, where's your GPA and where's your test score, and you see that you automatically qualify for $10,000, $15,000, whatever it is. But they're still using those two pieces of data to make that decision about how much money you get. So I tell most of my families, let's say you're shooting for mostly test blind schools. You may decide to apply to a few more at the end or later. And if you have a strong test score to submit, it can only help. So the nice thing I think about testing, the way I approach it now, is it's just icing on the cake. If you do well, we submit it. If you don't, then hopefully you won't need it, right? You won't need to worry about it. So it takes a bit more of that extra pressure, but I would still recommend doing it and doing it well, because it can help you on the back end. The third thing I was going to mention is that a couple of schools have started coming out saying they're going back to being test required. So MIT was the big one, and then Georgetown is another one that starting this next application cycle, they will be requiring testing again. So I have not seen other schools switching over. I'm sure there's a handful that will slowly start to come back. Many are going to stay test optional. But even in that test optional, and I do this always with quotes, because even the schools that are all test optional, what we've seen from the admission cycles, you are seeing that a higher rate of students who do submit a strong score that was within range of what past classes might have looked like, you are going to see a higher percentage of those students being admitted. So strong test scores are helpful, especially if you're a student that wants to be able to just have extra data to demonstrate that you can do the work. And the analogy that I tell a lot of my students is, think about if you're going through a recruiting kind of going through a recruiting cycle, and you are a college coach and you're looking at two different athletes. One is able to submit not only their height, their weight, but also they're able to submit game film. They're able to come to a camp. They're able to submit their 40-meter dash time and a beep test, right? And then another student only submits height and weight. It's really hard to judge those two when one has so much more information. So SAT or ACT, I mean, those tests are not the end all be all, but it does help a college have more context about a student, just more data, right? More information. So I would still think about, preparing, adequately for a test, and, do the best you can. It can only help you when you're in that application cycle. Any thoughts about that, Erica?
Yeah, I mean, part of what we do and what we strongly encourage all students to do is, regardless of what your decision is down the line, do the diagnostic tests. So that's something that we offer. We offer complimentary diagnostic exams, and then we recommend from there, based on how you do and what your starting score is. Hey, is this worth your time? Does it make sense for you to put in this time and effort to get a score? Is it within reach? Is it realistic? Because you're like you said, this is icing on the cake. This is just one component. And so it's not the end all be all, but if, let's say, 3 hours a week of work is going to put you in a better position for all these things that you mentioned, then it might, it would be a good thing. A lot of students that recently, just because of test optional and you might be taking on more things outside, just to supplement and boost your overall profile. A lot of them are also saying, okay, let's prepare for one test administration officially, and let's see how we do on that initial attempt. And then based on that, we can make a better decision as to, okay, should I push to prepare more and try and improve on top of this? Or are there other things I can spend my time with? And then for that, we'll usually work really closely with a counselor like you to say, does this make sense for them overall? Is this something that they definitely need? So there's a lot of a balancing act, I think, in figuring out what works best. But all of that starts from doing that diagnostic test. So I cannot, stress this enough. I talk to a lot of students who'll say, I don't think I'm going to do it because I'm going to apply to test optional only. And they come to us like a month before and say, oh no, I actually need to test and I need to try this. So it's better to have that knowledge up front and to be prepared rather than coming last minute and trying to cram in something that may or may not happen. So an informed decision, I think, is the most important thing.
Wonderful. Well, I'll definitely include all of your information. It's just Erica at ArborBridge.com. So I will share that out. But obviously, if there's any families that are wanting to schedule a diagnostic, learn a little bit more about what ArborBridge provides. I mean, I definitely reach out to Erica. She is my go-to, send all my records your way. And thank you so much for your time, sharing all this knowledge about all these updates. And I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Thanks.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Karen.